World of RPGs, Episode 21, Indigenous North America. Welcome to the World of RPGs, a podcast in which we travel around the globe and learn about the local role-playing game scenes. I'm your host Mo Bartz, and in Episode 21 we are going to North America. Oh wait, that's a whole continent. This episode will be a bit different from previous ones because we talk about the indigenous minorities of two countries on the North American continent. I cover Canada and its southern neighbor together because they're both majority English-speaking places and therefore probably have a lot of exchange, especially when it comes to games. Of course, Mexico and other countries in Central America are also North American and have indigenous peoples, but the majority language there is usually Spanish, and besides I'm planning to do a separate Mexico episode in the near future anyways. So I hope my Latin American listeners can forgive me when this North America episode only includes the two large majority English-speaking countries. In personal news, I finally managed to run a session of the Die RPG, and I'm about to visit Germany, where I will pick up some more gaming material to go through and hopefully run this summer. On to the episode. Canada and the USA are of course countries you've heard of. The general concept of this podcast is to cover role-playing scenes outside the large English-speaking mainstream. But for this episode, we're focusing on the indigenous peoples of the two countries, which, yes, also usually speak English, but have distinct centuries-old cultures which often get overlooked, including in gaming. I'm using plurals like peoples or cultures here because we're not talking about one language or one ethnic group. In fact, the indigenous peoples of North America are as diverse as the different nationalities in Europe, if not more so when it comes to language families, for example. In Canada, indigenous groups include the First Nations, Inuit and Métis, with about 2 million people, which is about 5% of the population. In the USA, the preferred term is Native Americans, and there are between 4 and 10 million people who are considered native, so between 1 and 3% of the population, depending on how you count. This episode is a bit more sensitive than the other country episodes because we're talking about cultures that were almost eradicated by white settlers beginning in the late 15th century through diseases, war, deportation, and forced assimilation, the latter which is still ongoing today. And I myself don't really know much about Native American history or culture, and I don't just want to summarize Wikipedia. Because of assimilation and mixed families, of course, many indigenous North Americans nowadays speak English as their main language and are often Christian, at least nominally. I suggest learning from a culture rather than about a culture, which, hey, is actually how I organized this podcast in general. Because while I actually do have ancestors from Canada and the USA, they are all of French and British descent. So I'm part Cajun but not Métis, and yes, that literally includes settlers. Speaking of Canada, we begin with the game master from the actual play from last episode.
My name's David Plamondon. I'm the team guide for Perpetuate Consulting and Perpetuate Games. I originally got into role-playing games when I was probably 10 or 11. I had a friend whose name was Emery who found a copy of, I can't remember the name of the role-playing game, but it was a superhero-based RPG. And we didn't really fully understand what tabletop RPGs were at the time, but we had played a lot of role-playing video games like Final Fantasy and Dragon Warrior. And so we were very obsessed with this idea of being able to create our own games or our own worlds and our own characters in these worlds. And I'd come from playing video game. I grew up in the 80s, so I was part of that kind of initial video game boom, home entertainment systems and arcades. So I was always really fascinated with games in general. And then, once I discovered role-playing games, it was a whole new world for me.
So which games are you playing nowadays?
Unfortunately, I'm still playing Dungeons and Dragons. It's still kind of the most popular game that folks kind of connect with and recognize. So at the store, there's still a lot of desire to play that system. But personally, my kind of three favorite systems right now are probably Shadow of the Weird Wizard by Schwab Entertainment, Dungeon Crawl Classics or any of the spin-offs, X-Crawl or Mutant Crawl Classics by Goodman Games, and of course Coyote and Crow by Coyote and Crow LLC.
So, Perpetuate Games, can you tell us how you started that and what you do there?
It started with Perpetuate Consulting, which we founded in 2019. So for a little bit of context, my background is working in both employment and education, particularly with Indigenous folks here in Canada. So I've had a lot of experience in seeing the firsthand challenges and barriers that Indigenous people experience transitioning kind of from youth into adulthood and trying to navigate whether it's post-secondary or employment situations. And so we had wanted to be part of a grassroots solution to help and create a better framework for Indigenous youth to make that transition. So the vision for Permetta Way Consulting initially was to utilize tabletop games, board games, role-playing games, card games, as a way of building foundational life skills for Indigenous youth and giving them that opportunity to engage in learning in a more unique way, in a way that's maybe a little bit more relevant to a lot of Indigenous learners and how they learn through experiential learning rather than rote-based learning. So our vision was to take tabletop board games and role-playing games, create scenarios or create educational guides, or I don't want to say lessons plan because we're not educators, but kind of create resources for teachers, librarians, community organizers who could utilize games as a way to help learn and engage with Indigenous youth. So we started working with some of the local organizations here where I live and doing some pilot projects, which were very well received. And then we started reaching out to different wholesaler distributors who would distribute these games. So the idea was we would take 4 or 5 games, workshop some content for them, and then bundle those into either workshops where we teach educators or just sell the game alongside with like our kind of guidelines on how you can use it in a classroom setting. And the response we got from a lot of wholesalers was very positive, but it was also almost entirely resounding. If you want to buy games from us at a wholesale capacity, you must have a brick and mortar retail. So that's when we decided to expand into creating a brick and mortar space, Pimento Way Games. And so we opened Pimento Way Games in 2021. And where I live here is Edmonton, Alberta, and it's a very crowded market. We actually have one of the highest per capita rates of game stores based on population, I think, compared to many places in Canada. And so it was already a very crowded market. And so when we decided we wanted to open the game store, we realized we had to have something that kind of sets us apart, aside from just being Indigenous owned and publicly Indigenous with our name and our logo and everything. So part of our drive was to create a more inclusive space, and not just inclusive for Indigenous folks, but for the LGBTQ2S plus community and other folks who have historically not been actively included into the gaming hobby. So that's kind of an abridged version of how we got to where we are today.
So you do have like a game store and sell the usual games. So being in Canada, would these be mostly in English, or do you also have like French stuff, for example?
It's predominantly English. Where I live in Western Canada. It's a very Anglophone province and city. There is a fairly prominent French Canadian representation here. And there is an appetite, I think, for French games. We actually were in talks with a couple folks around maybe supporting a French translation of Coyote and Crow, the role-playing game. That obviously didn't happen for a myriad of reasons, mostly cost. But yeah, for us, we focus typically on the Anglophone community here in Edmonton.
Yes, sorry. In Canada, I always mix up the geography. I've only been to Canada once, only to Niagara Falls. When somebody says West Canada, I always think it's on the East Coast for some reason. Sorry. And so you said you first had the consulting and then the brick and mortar store. And in the store, you have kind of events or similar things.
We do, yeah. So we host a weekly queer night. It's every Thursday evening, and it's just an opportunity for folks in the LGBTQS plus community to kind of have a space together and play games, feel kind of experience that safe space and that inclusive space. We are starting to dabble into more of like drop-in games, hosted events. We do host space for a couple other groups. We have a homeschooling group, a group of like connected homeschoolers that come in every Friday to use the space to play and socialize. We've worked with various nonprofits in the past. We've done Big Brothers Big Sisters. We've worked with a few organizations that support the in-house community. We've worked with some arts organizations. So for us, the space is really meant to be a community gathering space. Yes, we do sell board games and role-playing games. Yes, we do have a retail space, but primarily what our goal was always to do was to create that community-focused space because it's so inherently important to who we are as an organization, as a community, and as Indigenous people.
I found that there's some actual play recordings online from Pimetawa Games. Is that right?
Yeah, early on, we had tried to develop some online content. When Coyote and Crow had first launched, we had endeavored to try to do some actual play videos of Coyote and Crow. We provided a little bit of support and some how to play and kind of some world building videos. So, yes, I wouldn't say it was like ever something we did well or did consistently, but it is something we did do for sure.
I don't know if the next question would make sense, but I'll ask it anyway. If you have young Indigenous people playing role-playing games, for example, do you see any differences to how role-playing games are played by, for example, white Canadians?
Yeah, I have some pretty strong feelings about that. Growing up playing Dungeons and Dragons from second edition, So there's a lot to that. So bear with me while I answer this. I would say first and foremost, oral tradition, oral storytelling is so inherently specific to Indigenous culture, and that is really tied to our traditional culture. A lot of our creation stories, a lot of our spiritual and religious kind of backgrounds, a lot of our education came from oral tradition and oral history. And so for me, when I look at role playing games, yes, it is an activity where I can have fun and I can play a game and I can connect with others, but it's also such a valuable tool for teaching and for exposing people to new ideas, to different cultures. The beauty of role playing games is that it can help you understand complex social issues or geographical issues or cultural issues in a way that's a little bit more safe and contained. And it can allow marginalized youth, whether they're Indigenous or from other marginalized communities, experience things outside of what their normal worldview might be limited to based on their socioeconomic status or their geographic status. So I think that it's so important there. I think the other piece of it, and this is particularly relevant to me growing up playing role playing games, is that, and I'm not an expert in sociology, but I've worked with a few folks who are. We live in a very colonial system and a very colonial society, and that's often impacted by capitalism as well. And so, in both colonial systems and capitalist systems, the driving goal is to cater to whatever the dominant group is. And then a lot of times, that's non-Indigenous folks, it's non-people of color, it's non-queer folks. And so, from a capitalistic perspective, a lot of times that's just driven by going where the money is. So, there's a dominant community; those are going to be the folks that you want to market your materials to. But from a colonial system, it's also about cultural erasure and about removing any sense of place or being from those marginalized communities. So when we look at the history of, say, Dungeons and Dragons or other role-playing games, they tend to include multiculturalism or other cultures in such a tokenistic and oftentimes cliched way. And so when you look at some of the old fantasy art from D&D, there's various reflections of Indigenous people without any kind of context to what those cultures are, what their practices are, what the significance of those depictions are, whether it's regalia, whether it's totem poles or teepees or spiritual aspects. And so we tend to become props and tokens. And so there's like a long history of Indigenous peoples becoming props for European and non-Indigenous media in a way that doesn't respect or reflect our authenticity. And so both of those things are particularly problematic. And so when you start to have Indigenous people become more present in role-playing games, and both in the creation of and just the engagement of role-playing games, it allows them to reflect themselves and explore who they are and what their place is in those both real and fictional systems. And I think that's really important to allow for that sense of belonging in place. And that's really a big part of the work that we try to aim for in Pametaway is creating that sense of belonging in space for both Indigenous folks and the queer community.
I asked you before about the language of the games you sell, and as far as I'm aware, there's no role-playing product published in an Indigenous North American language. But do young people speak their background's languages, or are there any role-playing groups which use these languages, perhaps even for language teaching?
So there's an ongoing discussion around this. Indigenous languages are always at risk of being erased or forgotten, partially because of the tools of colonialism and the oppression that Indigenous people in North America have faced, but also just because it's not always practical. We live in a very Anglophone country, right? We live in a very Anglophone centric society. So English is the dominant language. There are exceptions throughout Canada where there are reclamations in specific nations, territories where they are reclaiming their language. And even here where I live in Edmonton, there's been a big push over the last few years to rename neighborhoods and rename our municipal wards using Cree language, which I think is great. But the problem is Canada, as a settler colonial state, has gone out of its way to try to erase Indigenous culture and Indigenous history. So we as I'm not young anymore, but young Indigenous folks are the victims of a system that is constantly trying to erase any sense of their culture and their being from the tableau of Canadian history. So they're being raised by victims of intergenerational trauma who got disconnected from that language, who were told from a young age, speaking your language is bad, and they were physically punished for speaking their languages. So there is a push to try to reclaim language. And I think in some areas it's better than others. And I think a lot of it comes down to the strength of the community and the resources available. But to answer your question, not that I know of, I don't think there is a lot of like traditional language games available. It's not a role playing game, it's a board game, but there's a game that's going to be coming out this year called Winter Rabbit, designed by a Cherokee designer. And what's really exciting about Winter Rabbit, aside from it just looking like a fantastic game, and that it's based off of Cherokee mythology and lore, it's also going to print in both English and in the traditional Cherokee language. So that is a game that is trying to push to normalize the Cherokee language. There, again, there's a practicality of it, right? I touched on the request that we had to maybe support a French language translation of Coyote and Crow, but even within French, and Canada has two official languages, English and French, but even in Canada, there isn't really that much of a push from what I've seen. And again, I live in a very Anglophone city and province, but there isn't really a huge market for French board games, right? And I think even in Europe, you see that where there's a lot of bilingual folks. I have friends who are in Germany. I have friends who are in the Netherlands, and they're expected to speak both English and Dutch or German. So yes, you can get more options for language translations, but the Anglophone world is still very dominant in the board game industry. And, if you compare the number of Dutch speakers or German speakers or French speakers globally to the number of Cree speakers or Dene speakers, it's going to be a disproportionate number and skewed against Indigenous people. So it doesn't always make practical sense to do that, right? And so because board gaming and role-playing games are still by and large driven by commerce and capitalism, they're going to go where the money is.
From the games you have in your shop, which ones would you recommend show Indigenous North American life in a respectful way? Which ones, like if you as a white person or any other non-Indigenous person goes into your shop, which game would you recommend to them?
And so this is a conversation we have often, right? I think the best game that I've seen is a game called Nunami, which is unfortunately no longer in print. So Nunami was designed by an Inuit designer, Thomas Mangiuk, out of northern Quebec. And Nunami was this wonderful 2 or 4 player abstract game that was meant to kind of reflect life on the tundra, day-to-day life for Inuit people and traditional life for Inuit people. And it was this beautiful game that had traditional Inuit art done by Thomas, and I think it was his mother and his daughter. And it was very simple gameplay, but the whole kind of underlying tone of the game was this balance between humans coming out onto the land and then nature, and this kind of precarious balance between the two. And it was such a love letter to Thomas's experience as an Inuit man, and such a beautiful game. So that's kind of my gold standard. Coyote and Crow was really fantastic as well, or any of the games that are tied into the Coyote and Crow world, Wolves and Nasi. But Coyote and Crow takes a different tact. Coyote and Crow takes more of a solar punk kind of view of it, of here's what an Indigenous North America or Turtle Island could look like if it was both free of colonial impact, but also there's a supernatural or sci-fi element to Coyote and Crow as well that kind of created this accelerated technological timeline. So it's a beautiful game, and it's a beautiful look at, solar punk or sci-fi themes influenced by Indigenous values and culture. But and this isn't a criticism of Coyote and Crow at all, but what it does is it kind of creates this what if scenario, right? What if it's not a practical what if Indigenous people were never impacted by colonization. It's what if Indigenous people were not impacted by colonization and there was this sci-fi element introduced, right? So it does allow Indigenous youth to put themselves into that really popular sci-fi setting, which I think is super valuable, but it doesn't really convey traditional Indigenous culture in the same way that a game like Nunami would. I know another game that gets brought up oftentimes is Spirit Island. Spirit Island, I think, is a fantastic game from a design standpoint, and I think it's a step in the right direction in terms of kind of flipping the traditional model of colonization as a driving force behind the gameplay, in so much as in Spirit Island, colonizers are the antagonists of the game. But my challenge with Spirit Island from an Indigenous perspective is, and if you've never played, the core concept is you are playing magical spirits on this kind of traditional Indigenous island where the Indigenous people are called the Dahani. And my challenge there is that, yes, you are framed as stopping colonization, which is good, but you're also representing these Dahani as these Indigenous people that have no actual agency on their own. They can't protect themselves. They can't survive. And you're also leaning into this mystic Indigenous trope of, we can control the spirits and the elements and the animals, and we can call on these forces greater than ourselves, which is fine from a sci-fi or from a fantasy perspective. I'm not inherently opposed to it, but it still does lean on those tropes that I think ultimately are harmful to Indigenous people. What I'd really like to see from role-playing games and tabletop games is incorporating modern Indigenous people more into the reflection of what games look like. And so an example is I was asked to do a little bit of light consulting for a game that was really based off of like a professional development tool. It was going to be a project management kind of game. And the idea was you have cards that represent different people on your team that have different skills and strengths. And the idea is you kind of like navigate through putting together these teams. And the artist had designed a really good multicultural and diverse group of folks. There was a person of color that was like a safety specialist. It had like a safety vest on, and there was a Hispanic woman and whatever. And then he showed me his North American Indigenous and Native American characters, and they were wearing like full regalia and beads and like all these things. And I was like, if I'm an Indigenous professional, I'm not going up to work dressed in, buckskin and a headdress, right? Like there's time and place. Those are ceremonial things that have a relevant place to my culture, but they're not relevant to my day-to-day professional work. So I was like, why do all of your other non-Indigenous people just look like professionals that happen to be, black or queer or whatever? But your Indigenous people are like, they have this big flashing proverbial neon sign that says, hey, look at me, I'm Indigenous, right? That's not the reality of Indigenous people by and large. Like, yes, we do dress in regalia when we're going to powwow or we're going to ceremony, but by and large, our day-to-day attire is t-shirts and jeans or dress shirts or suits and ties, depending on what the context is. So why can't we just be represented by that? I have long hair because it's relevant to my culture. And so like you could just have a normal person who has darker skin, higher cheekbones, has long hair, but otherwise they look like every other character in the game, right? So that's part of my challenge when we're representing Indigenous people is it doesn't have to fall into these tropes. And they can. Again, like Nunami is a cultural historical game that represents that traditional life, and that's fine. Another game that I think did a really good job was the original printing of Wendake, which is a game about the Wendoc people in the Huron area. And what was interesting about that game was you played different Wendoc tribes, and there was a basic game where everyone had like the same kind of abilities, but then there was also an asymmetrical game where you could play different specific tribes, and each tribe had their own kind of like special abilities and everything. And it was set during the French-English War in the Huron area, but that was a backdrop to the game. The French and the English were just doing their thing, and it would impact your gameplay, but by and large, the players were playing Indigenous tribes that were competing for resources and territories. And so I thought that was really interesting. And the printing I have, I don't remember who the original publisher was, but I know Renegade publishes it now. But the printing I had like a 6 or 8 page document that was like an educational guide talking about the history of these Indigenous tribes. And it seemed like it was well intentioned and well researched and really reflective of the true history, or at least truer history than what we see in a game like, Great Western Trail or Netatonka, which are both games that are Great Western Trail is not inherently problematic, but when you look at the first edition printing of Great Western Trail, where you had this section of the board that was Indian land, right? And I don't think that was the term they used, but that was what they would have called it in that history of time. And the Indians were there to limit your progress and to basically shake you down for money. And then when they reprinted it to the second edition, they said, well, we want to be more inclusive. So we're going to add characters of color to your characters that you can hire. And we're going to remove the Indigenous people and replace them with bandits. So it's like, okay, so that's how you saw Indigenous people in the first place. And we were just kind of a token effort towards being there. And again, historically speaking, if you were a cattle driver in early America or early Canada, yes, Indigenous people were resistant to you coming onto their land, but that's because it was our land and our territories, and we were given broken promises. So it's a really complicated issue. One other game, sorry, and I should mention it, I think one of the really powerful games is called Burn the Fort. It was designed and published by an Indigenous activist who's unfortunately no longer with us, Clee Benelli. I didn't know Clee personally. We had interacted a few times around the game, but I didn't get a chance to meet him personally. But from what I understand, posthumously, he was a musician, he was an activist, and he was a game designer. And he designed, published, and released a game called Burn the Fort. And Burn the Fort, again, is another look at telling the true history of settler colonialism in Turtle Island. I mean, this is a very US centric game, but I mean, it's similar in Canada. And the concept of Burn the Fort is that invaders have come to your land and they are trying to build a fort, and once that fort is built, that's going to be a stronghold in which they can continue to oppress your people. And so your job as Indigenous war leaders is to disrupt wagons bringing supplies to the fort and try to prevent this fort from being completed. So that is a valid look at history from an Indigenous perspective, right? There's that old adage, history is written by the winners. And so when you look at North American history, it's always from that settler colonial mindset of, we settled the West, we settled North America, but North America was already settled by us. We lived a very solid and sustainable lifestyle here pre-contact with Europeans. And just because we didn't have the same pursuit of material wealth or the same focus on written language doesn't mean that we weren't advanced in our own ways and didn't have our own sciences and cultural practices, right? So that's what's interesting about Burn the Fort is that it really kind of frames it as in a similar way to what Spirit Island tried to do, but from a more Indigenous perspective of we are the protagonists of our story. The backdrop are not a barrier that needs to be overcome by colonialism.
Those were my questions. Do you want to add anything before I stop the recording?
Just that I think that representation is super important, not just for Indigenous folks, but for folks who have historically been excluded from role-playing games and board games. And that includes the Black community, that includes broadly people of color, the queer community. One of the beauties of tabletop gaming, whether it's role-playing or board games, is that it can bring everyone together. And play in general is such a multicultural concept. And, different cultures and different groups of people have different views or representations of what play does or can or historically has looked like, but we all as people are so inherently in need of that opportunity to play. And we are so in need of that opportunity to be represented. And so when I talk about representation, it's not about saying there needs to be less white people or less cisgendered people. It's not about taking space away from people who are typically represented in these things. It's about creating additional space for those people who haven't been represented. And I think that nuance gets lost so often. And there's this knee-jerk reaction from folks who want to push it back against EDI or equality practices because they think it's taking something away from them. I'm not trying to take space away from anybody. I'm just trying to create additional space for people who have never had that opportunity to have that space.
We stay in Canada with a gaming blogger and author.
Hello, my name is Theodore Bana, and I'm from Labrador. I'm Inuit, and I got into role-playing games living in St. John's. The first role-playing game I ever bought was Stormbringer by Michael Moorcock, and I was a big fan of Michael Moorcock's fiction. And it was very funny to read his books like The Ice Schooner about the Arctic that always portrayed the Arctic as this terrible frozen hellscape, empty place. And coming from a place that has a lot of natural beauty and culture and animals and landscapes, I was always kind of saddened that Western fantasy reduces Arctic places to just wastelands. That was the start of my role-playing journey, and I played lots of games, and that kind of pushed me last year to try and make my own game about the Arctic.
Can you maybe say a bit about that game?
Yeah, so I applied last February, I think, for the Chaosium role-playing game design contest, and my proposal was a game called Nuna, which means land in Inuktitut, the language of the Inuit. It was a post-apocalyptic land that is in the Arctic Circle, but isn't a frozen wasteland. It's a very living land with different seasons and beautiful different things to do in those seasons. But it's also has non-Inuit people. So the main people in that game, Nuna, are the Inuit, who are considered the big heroes. But they're also whalers who come from European heritage. And then there are the Southern Inuit, which is my people in real life, who always were mixed because in Labrador is the only place in Canada where the Inuit lived on the coast of an ocean where Europeans came. It was on the Atlantic coast. And more than any other Inuit place in Canada, intermixing was normal. So I just wanted to kind of celebrate that intermixing, but also go past colonialism and say, okay, let's say the colonial capitalist system that we know now breaks down, and then the world in Labrador, at any rate, is rebuilt with Inuit people and their wisdom guiding people to survive. So I thought that would be an interesting game, and I sent it into Chaosium, and lo and behold, it won.
At the moment, it's not published yet, but in the planning. Is that right?
I did a Kickstarter last year, and it was a great education in Kickstart, but it wasn't a good Kickstarter. No, it was a good Kickstarter, but there were so many errors you make because when you research Kickstarter, a lot of the advice is very general advice. And indie role-playing games is such a niche genre. You have to know all the little intricacies of Kickstarter for that genre, and I didn't. But I think I learned enough of those intricacies through the process that right now I'm a bit busy with real life, but hopefully later this year when I get some free time and energy, I can revive Nuna and do my second Kickstarter, and we'll see where it goes.
You said it's a Chaosium design challenge, so was that based on basic role-playing system rules?
The undercarriage, of course, is the BRP rules, D100, and that takes a lot of work away because you don't have to think up a new mechanic or try to imagine something that replicates. I mean, everyone understands how the D100 works, but what's nice is over the years, if you go back to Chaosium's older products, there was a lot of really imaginative design bolted onto that D100 framework. So if you go back to things like Stormbringer would have, if everybody was a beggar, the more beggars you had, the better you were with the dagger. So beggars mobbing people was this mechanic that really brought out the flavor of the game world. And that's kind of what I was aiming at.
Yeah, I just realized that Stormbringer is also basic role-playing. I hadn't noticed that before. Coming back to your role-playing roots, so you said you've played Stormbringer and now you're working on a BRP adjacent game. What other games have you played in the past?
Like everyone, I started with D&D, probably OD&D and 2E, and I played that for many years, but the limitations of the system were very evident from the start. I played Shadowrun, Rifts, Robotech, before we started kind of throwing away or moving past those old mechanical designs and moving into more story games. And the past couple of years, I've played some story games, Lasers and Feelings, which it's a one-page game, but it's amazing. And a few other ones who can't really remember right now. But I was very impressed with story games, Powered by the Apocalypse and stuff like that, which kind of stepped away from trying to replicate reality and said, let's replicate a good story. Let's have these story mechanics. I played one called Earthsworn, and my gosh, it was such a good game. It was a Norse game, but half of the first session is just deciding what the world is like. The game master really sharing the power of the narrative with the players. I was inspired by that. And I think you can even do the same thing in Chaosium if you make the effort.
If I understand it right, you also have a role-playing blog, don't you?
Yeah, for, I believe, 11 years now, I've been writing a blog called Tomb of Tutankhamen, and I did a big project called Stormbringer Redux. Old Chaosium games had this inclination where they would put kind of quasi-narrative mechanics in there, but as history went on, they just kind of retreated from that and just made it purely mechanical. And I kind of want to revive some of those old attempts they made, especially the first 4 editions of Stormbringer had lots of these weird, very evocative little tiny rules scattered throughout the book, and very hard to find because they didn't have a good glossary and they didn't really organize it very well. But like, for example, if you were a noble, you were allowed to have 1d6 hawks. And the funny thing is that's not in the description of noble. It's later in like under hawks or something. And you say, like, why didn't you just put this in both areas? And I suppose they were trying to save page numbers or something like that. So throughout, if you read that book, there's tons of stuff hidden there that's very evocative. And that's kind of what I aspire to.
You also had some things about Japanese culture.
Yeah, when I started the blog, I was living just outside Kyoto. And the first thing that really hit and got really taken up on Reddit, and somebody has put it into a PDF, is Weird in Japan. Because there's a lot of role-playing games about Japan. But the thing is, they're not really about Japan. They're just basically D&D and funny hats. You know, instead of a longsword, you've got a katana. Instead of a wizard, you're a shugenja. And D&D started that with Oriental Adventures. But to my knowledge, there's not that many games that really replicate Japan. Because the thing about Japan is, if you're playing a Western Knight in D&D, you're going to try your never say die. But if you're playing a samurai and your lord says, kill yourself, you go, okay. I mean, you have to. That's the vertical society. So that's how do you replicate that as a game experience for Westerners who are used to never surrendering? There's Bushido, and there's Oriental Adventures, Legend of the Five Rings, and then there's a ton of indie games. They're all interesting, but when we're playing a role-playing game, and your podcast is about culture, I want to play in the culture. I don't want to just have normal D&D painted over as Japanese or painted over as native, right? I want something that kind of replicates me and puts me in the role of someone in that culture. This is what I see with the failings with a lot of cultural role-playing games, is that on the surface they say, oh, the role-playing game set in such and such a culture, but they don't really evoke that in the rules or kind of the setting. And I found Coyote and Crow did that amazingly well, I think. But I mean, look who made it. It is all Indigenous people.
And now you've also worked on a game connected to Japanese culture.
Right. Wrote this game. Well, it's not finished yet. And real life is kind of kicking me hard right now. So I won't be able to finish it for a few months at least. It's called Giri Ninjo. And Giri Ninjo means duty and humanity. And when you notice a lot of role-playing games set in Japan, they talk about honor. But Japanese people don't say the word honor very much. They don't say, oh, you besmirched my honor. That's more of a Western thing. But if you're talking about what makes Japanese people tick internally, and if you're going to role-play a Japanese person, what you'd have to really try to replicate is they're always choosing between following their duty or expressing their humanity. And that's the daily struggle for Japan, even now, since the feudal period has ended in Japan. So I kind of want to replicate that. So I took the bare bones of Lasers and Feelings. And so there was only one attribute, Giri and Ninjo, duty and humanity. But I've added lots of other choices to make the characters interesting. Like I said, problem right now is real life is preventing me from getting much gaming done. So hopefully in the next month or so, that'll clear up.
But you have finished a novel recently.
Yeah, among other other things. I've been writing this novel for like 4 years. I was stuck on trains in Japan. I had a 5-hour commute at one point.
Oh my God.
Yeah, 2.5 hours in the train one way, 2.5 hours back. and I had a small child. And I finished off my PhD thesis just writing it in the Osaka subway. And then I switched to universities, and I still had a 3 hour commute every day, which is normal in Japan. 3 hours is nothing in Japan, right? I looked at all the people around me and I said, God, these people look like ghosts. They don't even look like they're alive. Everyone's kind of like a zombie going to work. So I started writing a book called Heisei Ghosts about an invasion of ghosts in 1990s, 2000s Japan. It wrote itself basically, and I had a bit of free time the past month. So I just sat down, finished it off, put it on Amazon, and now it's selling. So,
is it only on Amazon or also available somewhere else?
Unfortunately, I was talking to, I won't say the name, but kind of a famous author from Japan, and he had given my name to a literary agent, but it looked like such a long, involved process. And when you do your first novel, you always get a very kind of not very good deal. So I thought maybe I'll put my first novel out independent, and then if I got the idea for a second novel, then I'd search for an agent and I'd be able to say, well, I've already got one novel finished. So we'll see how that goes.
Now we come to the awkward questions, and that's a bit more about Inuit culture or First Nations culture in Canada. My first question, and it's probably not answerable, but are you aware of any gaming groups in Canada who play in one of the native languages?
That is a great question. And unfortunately, I just came back to Canada the year before last. And when I left Canada, being an Indigenous person still wasn't something you talked about much unless you were living up north. So it was either you lived it or you kind of didn't talk about it. And since I came back, I've noticed there's a lot more pride and people are trying to revitalize their Indigenous languages. So I'm not surprised there's gaming groups, but personally, I don't know any.
Let's get even more awkward. The depiction of Inuit or other native peoples in North America in other games. For example, you said you've played Shadowrun. Is there anything there that stood out to you or that you found interesting or bad?
I just remember that it's been a long while. It's been decades since I played it, but I just remember from the books pictures of elves in war paint and orcs and stuff with kind of bones in their nose and kind of primitive accoutrements. And I found that a bit disappointing because elf is like a Western fairy tale image. And just to graph on some war paint, and like war paint is the worst depiction of an Indigenous person you can put out there because you're looking at the person just as like a violent savage. So I was very disappointed, I remember, at that depiction. And then I think sometimes in fantasy, they just find it easier to use an archetype. So dwarves are kind of portrayed as, I don't know, some greedy gold diggers that, and it's kind of hinted at what culture they are. And orcs are like savages with shaman. They don't have wizards, they have shamans. And if they have shamans, then the orcs are supposed to be a cognate of Indigenous people. And I think 15, 20 years ago, there was a newspaper article somebody wrote called Orc Holocaust, and about how it was depicted that in D&D it's okay to kill orcs because they're not human and they're not good. And when you go back to the Indian Wars in the United States, that was the exact same depiction. So I thought that was really lazy writing and not very sensitive. But it was back in the 80s and 90s, people weren't very sensitive about these things.
I'm actually through with my questions. Is there anything you want to add?
One thing I'll say about my own role playing as an Indigenous person endeavor is that for me, it's a way to kind of reclaim my identity. When I left Canada in 1996 to go to Japan, we didn't tell people, well, I told people I was Indigenous, and some people were not very nice about it. And Japan was good for a couple of years, and then it had its own things I didn't like, so I came back 2 years ago. And every place you go in Canada, they're acknowledging Indigenous people, and you're in a coffee shop and they're saying, this is thanks to the Squamish people. And you're like, wow, this is great. And there's Indigenous studies jobs. I just interviewed for an Indigenous studies educator position at a university. I don't know if I'll get it, but I mean, that was very interesting. So for me, I don't speak Inuit, maybe a couple of words. I've forgotten everything I knew as a kid. And like I said, I'm Southern Labrador Inuit. I'm Nunatkavut, which is mostly mixed race. So to me, writing a game is also a very good way to reconnect to that identity, because a lot of us are living in cities. We're not living way up north. And going back up north is very expensive and time consuming. And one of the biggest issues I see now with Indigenous people is in America, it's kind of okay whether you have status or you don't have status. But in Canada, I don't want to get too particular here, but people who don't have status, there are a lot of groups that are Indigenous, and you look at them and you know they're Indigenous, but they don't have status and they don't have government funding just because of political or historical ways that they were living. And part of this is due to the colonial, we had a thing called the Indian Act. And in the Indian Act, they tried to get rid of Indigenous people by tracing the line of the mother. So if the mother married a white person, then she wasn't considered Indigenous anymore. And her children weren't Indigenous, even though they looked Indigenous and maybe they lived in the community. So this was genocide by extraction from the population to reduce. And now the Indigenous population in North America is, if I recall, is the most fastest growing population. Some people are Indigenous and they're proud of it, but just the government hasn't recognized it yet. And other groups are they don't want to share their funding. Whereas I think, we should be building longer tables. We shouldn't be building higher walls. And I was very pleased when I was doing Nuna that there were lots of Inuit people who were living way up north who were saying, I like this, it represents us, thank you very much. I think I had one person who said, oh, this is not like the Inuit I know. And the thing is, Inuit are living from above California all the way to above New York. I mean, that's thousands of kilometers. So it's not like it's one big monolithic culture. It was the Inuit of Labrador and the Inuit of Alaska lived very different lives. And even within Alaska, there were different communities that had very different lifestyles based on the land they were in. If a game like mine or Coyote and Crow can help someone who is half or a quarter Indigenous to reconnect with their Indigenous heritage, I think that's a great thing.
And finally, to the USA, because we already mentioned Coyote and Crow, and we need to know more about it.
Hi, my name's Derek Pounds. I'm a member of the Samish Indian Nation, and I was a writer and developer on Coyote and Crow. I got into role-playing games probably the same way a lot of people did. I moved into a new town when I was 9, and a kid down the street, his older brother, played D&D. And so we got a hold of their books and tried it out. I was DM for my first game. They kind of tricked me into doing that. They had played a little bit before me. And in my first game, I had the players fight off against Worf from Star Trek The Next Generation. So that was sort of my origin story with RPGs. And I've been involved in it ever since.
And which other games have you played then?
Oh, I've played tons of games. I love trying new indie RPGs. Probably my favorites are, I love Apocalypse World. It was kind of the first of the Powered by the Apocalypse games. I love the games of Avery Alder, who created, one second, let me look up a quick game.
Monster Hearts, The Quiet Year.
The Quiet Year is the one I was thinking of. Yeah, their map-making game.
Yeah, I played it the other day.
Oh, it's wonderful. I've played a lot of Fate, played a lot of Shadowrun, Dogs in the Vineyard. I've tried a bunch of indie games. I go to an indie con here most years, so.
And where's that con?
Sorry, I live in Seattle, Washington.
You mentioned you worked for Coyote and Crow. Can you say a bit about how that came to be and what they do?
Yeah, I started working with Connor Alexander, who was the founder of Coyote and Crow, back in 2020 during the pandemic. He and I belonged to some of the same Facebook groups, and he was looking for a writer from the Pacific Northwest who could help him develop that nation for his core game, Coyote and Crow. I had never done any professional writing before that, but I told him, well, I'm from the Pacific Northwest. I'm from the Samish tribe up here, so I'm willing to try if you're willing to, give me a shot. He agreed, and I created the Tiswak Nation that is found in the book. Also, I had a longer history in RPGs than most of the other people working on the game. And so me and Connor worked together a lot on developing the rules and the rest of the core book, the way the information was laid out for people and the way descriptions were done, things like that. So I had a fair hand in the core book. I was really proud of the work we all did.
So let's talk a bit about the game. So I've actually read Coyote and Crow, but I've never played it. I was one of the Kickstarter supporters back then. And can you maybe quickly summarize a bit how that game came to be, and then maybe a bit about the setting and the rules?
Well, how the game came to be, that was Connor Alexander just saw that Native Americans weren't well represented in the RPG space and thought that there was, room for that to happen. Connor is a member of the Cherokee Nation. And so he came up with this world where colonization never happened, but rather being set in past, which all the previous Indigenous RPGs had been, so far as I know. He set this in the not too distant future. So it's an Indigenous futurist vision of a world where colonization didn't happen. In the game, it's all based in the North American continent, which many tribes here call Turtle Island. In it, the core activity is really, it's an exploration game and an investigation game. That's where it sort of sings the best. Combat in it is very deadly, so you're encouraged to find other solutions to your problems. The typical character in Coyote and Crow is a member of the Suyeta, which is a member of the kind of special forces for the city of Cahokia, which is based on a real Indigenous city here in North America. And you and your small team of people go and investigate threats to the city, investigate crime, and your characters have special ability. Whether these are magical, spiritual, or whether they are scientific is kind of up to the storyteller. I often describe them to people who aren't familiar with the game as very similar to X-Men powers. Like you have a single superpower which you can develop and use throughout the course of the game.
Yeah, I found the rules were on a similar basis as White Wolf's storyteller system. I mean, they were not based on them, but quite similar with dice pools and target numbers, and that you add attributes and skills. So kind of a similar engine to me.
Oh, absolutely. Connor came up through a lot of playing Vampire the Masquerade, Werewolf the Apocalypse, games like that. So that was definitely a heavy inspiration for him. I agree.
Yeah, and there are also some supplements already out. I think there are 2 adventure collections and a novel, and I think a dice game based in the same world, isn't there?
Correct. Yeah, there is one set of 10 short adventures that are out. I wrote one of those. There is also another book that has been successfully kickstarted called Ahutiko, which is basically a setting book. It is a book that deep dives into a single small kind of weird town, a little bit inspired by like Twin Peaks. Rest in peace, David Lynch, but the same sort of feel and attitude to it. Then, there's the Nasi dice game, which is a game that exists within the Coyote and Crow universe. And there's also the Wolves board game, which was also kickstarted, which is a cooperative competitive game about surviving a long winter within the world of Coyote and Crow. So it's not a game that exists within the world, it's a game about the world. Coming fairly soon is going to be the Kickstarter for the Primacy card game, which is a card game for the Coyote and Crow universe. I've done some playtesting and a little bit of writing for that. So that's coming up.
Have you heard of, on the one hand, the reception of the game in different cultures? I mean, outside the US, but also inside the US, for example, among Native Americans. How was the feedback there?
Honestly, I haven't heard of any feedback outside of North America. I know that pretty much every Native American person I've spoken to, Indigenous North American person that is, has been a largely very positive reception. It's a role-playing game that is designed largely by Native Americans for Native Americans, and so represents us in a way that we haven't seen before. And it creates a world where our cultures are empowered and our traditions are honored. But the feedback has been largely positive. Right after the game came out, there was certainly some negative pushback by groups that felt it was racist against Caucasians for not representing them within the game. We took those arguments as largely a joke, though. I mean, the people weren't being humorous, but we didn't really care about that kind of criticism of the game.
Yeah, as a white person, I can say it's a silly criticism that doesn't make sense. Maybe one thing I want to talk about, speaking of people from different cultures playing the game, what I found very interesting was there were a lot of sidebars in the book with advice, on the one hand, for Indigenous North American people playing the game and also for non-Indigenous people. I've never seen that in a role-playing game before. Maybe you can say a bit about how that came to be and what's in there.
Well, we definitely knew from the beginning, we want people from every culture to play this game. We want people to see Native Americans within their power and sort of how we see ourselves. But we knew people were going to struggle with that, especially people who were worried about cultural appropriation. And we didn't really think there was going to be a lot of people trying our game that weren't sensitive to those ideas. So we wanted to make sure we had some advice in there for how to play this game without being appropriative, how to play this game without being offensive to Indigenous people. So the advice largely comes down to play your characters as people and don't try to represent a specific tribe. Don't try and be what you think of as Navajo or Cherokee or something like that, because you're probably going to make mistakes and it might end up coming off as offensive. But we also encourage people who are from Native American tribes to incorporate their own cultural traditions, their own ceremonies, things like that into the game to give it a layer of reality. And the way we built the world, there's a lot of cultures that can be represented that just don't exist in North America anymore. So you have a lot of openness, but also a lot of the peoples have conglomerated into basically non-tribal societies. So while there are certainly Samish people still within the Tiswak Nation, there are also people who don't identify with any particular tribe and just consider themselves Tiswak. So we really allow for a broad approach to playing the different types of characters in the game.
You said you played various games, and one where I listened up was Shadowrun, because of course that includes a couple of, I haven't read any Shadowrun books in decades. It was in the 90s, but depictions of Native American people in some way, but written by non-natives. So what's your experience with how Native American cultures are shown in role-playing games? Maybe with examples. For me, Shadowrun and Werewolf the Apocalypse comes to mind. How does that come across to people like you?
It's one of those things where, starving for representation, at least me as a kid, grabbed onto whatever I could see. It's one of the reasons I loved Shadowrun at the time, because it showed, Native Americans living in the future, having cyberware and martial arts and things like that. So I was very excited about it. As I learned more about it, I saw that, this isn't being written by Native people. These cultures aren't being represented terribly well. But that came later. At the time, I was just excited to see myself in a game in a way that I hadn't seen it before. Modern Shadowrun does a lot better with Native American representation. I believe they do use Native American consultants to talk about the tribal societies within the game. Similarly, there was Werewolf the Apocalypse that represented several different kind of broad Native American groupings. And that one did have some Native writers on it originally. I would say still from a modern lens, there are some things that aren't great about it, but I think that they did better than most, especially for back in the early 90s, which was kind of when you first started seeing Native Americans being represented in a playable way in the RPGs, unlike, games like Boot Hill, where they were just a opposition. Dungeons and Dragons in the early 90s made an attempt at Native American representation with Maztica, which was a Central American focused setting. But that once again didn't really consult with any Native Americans. It was based on just basic, encyclopedia research and, folklore and sort of the westernized perception of what Central American cultures were like. Also, just with coming up as a Native American playing role-playing games, like most gamers, I think, I mostly played D&D. And it quickly became apparent to me as I was growing up in the game that D&D has all the set dressing of Lord of the Rings, but really the storylines of the typical D&D adventure is very much the American Western. It's people within civilization trying to bring civilization to a wild place around them. And in America, that is what the Western is about. And so the people in the wild place are automatically they take the appearance of Native Americans, at least from the way the civilized people view them. I've even had games where the core activity, as described by the game master, was colonization, and I've had to have conversations about that. And like a lot of people of color and a lot of Native Americans specifically, I'm sure, I often had to make the choice between saying something about something that I thought was sort of a negative representation or biting my tongue so that I could keep my friends and stay in the game. And back then, I probably bit my tongue more. These days, I speak up more. Yeah, Native American representation in RPGs was not great in the 90s. And I think that those of us who played kind of just did the best with what we had. I don't think you saw a lot of like native created Native American representation until like the 2010s with games like Edragor was one of the first games I know of that came out. That was kickstarted in 2012.
Yeah, that would have been my next question. The other Native American games, or are there any organizations or some kind of networks to connect culture and gaming there in some way?
Honestly, I wish there was, but I don't know of any networks or organizations. But there are like a few other Native games that I know of. Like I said, there's Edragor that was made by Alan Turner, who I think is Lakota. And it's a game about tribal societies that are migratory and their survival. It's based on Fate Core. There's one game that I recently discovered. I was doing a little bit of research for this podcast called Dog Eat Dog, which was actually made by a Filipino man, Liam Burke. That kind of represents colonization and the way that works, and the mechanics of it very much remind me of The Quiet Year. So that's a game that I had been planning on sitting down with my friends and playing. I bought it on Drive-Thru-RPG the other day. And then more recently in 2018, like just before the pandemic, there was Nuahal, which is an indigenous Mexican game about basically shapeshifters fighting angels. And that is a rad game. It's one of the Powered by the Apocalypse games, and I've played that a few times. That one was made by Miguel Espinoza. But as far as like organizations to bring more Native Americans into RPGs, I don't know of any. Certainly that was the inspiration behind the donation option for the Coyote and Crow Kickstarter, to get more of these books into Indigenous libraries so we can kind of build up a bigger population of Native American gamers who might have been turned off by the representation that they've seen.
Have there been situations where Native Americans played role-playing games in their native languages, or do you play in English?
I play in English. I have been trying to learn the Samish language, but I am not gifted with languages, so it's been taking me a long time to even learn like basic introductions and things like that. I would hope that there are people out there using this as a means of language revitalization. I know that the Ahutiko Kickstarter included some work on making it more accessible to the Lumi language, which is another language up here in the Pacific Northwest. I haven't heard of anything like that. I haven't heard of any organized groups who are using role-playing games as a way of revitalizing their languages, though, no.
So thank you for listening to episode 21 of The World of RPGs. The intro music was Battle of the Dragons by Thomas Mutziu, who I just chatted with a week ago, and the logo is by Iber Karakash. A special thanks goes out to all my interviews from Turtle Island that helped bring this together. As always, you can find links to everyone I interview with the website, actual plays, and much more in the show notes. As for recommendation, there's an interview with French Canadians on the Polishing RPGs YouTube channels. It's 3 hours long, so I honestly have not watched it myself yet. Please follow and like this podcast on your player of choice or the social media you follow. And after North America and having done Spain and Portugal recently, I thought that Latin American country should be next. But then I had a business trip to a different place this March and made some contacts there. To be fair, this kind of sounds like Spanish or Portuguese, doesn't it?
Nimeni nu mă ascultă. Pe cuvântul meu, am fost regele dracilor, nu mă asculta nimeni.
Da, să știi că mi se pare că ți se întoarce pur și simplu, că nici tu nu asculți de nimeni. Știi când mai ții minte de câte ori ziceam, hei, hai să... Și tu deja porneai?
Da, și nu regret absolut nimic.
Cam asta face și Infernal cu tine.
Bun, perimetru?
Pot să mă duc să încerc să pescuiesc niște hamsi pentru Bugi?
Nu vrei să vii să facem o baie?
Nu mai mult de 2, vă rog. Da? Să păstrăm o strajă?
Așa intenționam și eu.
Doamna mea,
Da.
poți să vezi dacă este în regulă, dacă merg să fac o baie cei doi?
Da, cum
Dacă să fie atacat sau ceva cu puterile tale mistice.
Cred că poate să prevadă ea viitorul oricum.
Da, eu simt că marea este liniștită și nu mai bună de băgat piciorul în ea, ceea ce mi-aduce aminte și scope piciorul și arăt, asta este marea.
Ce este picioruș?
Piciorul
Într-un lemnișor
cu care vorbesc. Uite, mare, ți-am promis că ți arăt, uite, asta este marea.
E apă.
Este multă apă. O să te aduc, tu poți...
O cadă.
Este o cadă naturală a pământului. Sunt multe căi din astea unde se...
Este un lighean.
Foarte mare, exact. Este ca un lighean foarte mare.
Este un strand.
Exact. Doar un strand pentru toată lumea.
Cum s-a făcut un strand așa mare?
Într-o zi mai mare le-a spus să fie
N-auziți
strand.
doar ce zice ea, n-auziți.
Da, ca cine?
Într-o zi mai mare le-a zis să fie strand și strand a fost și iată-l. Întins în fața noastră, te-aș aduce mai aproape, dar te umfli de la apă. Dar iată, așa arată strandul.
Ciubută, tu ai pe cineva de care nu știu, adică pare că tot restul, adică, mă rog, Iancu avea toate femeile pe
Doar
care
ca
le
să
întâlnea.
vizualizez. Micul Ciubotă umblă legat cu frânghii tot timpul